The bus exhaled a cloud of exhaust and pulled away, leaving behind a swirl of gravel and a girl who didn't want to be noticed. Zariah Miles stood frozen for a second at the front steps of Merryweather High. The air in Stone Mount, Pennsylvania was colder than she was used to, thinner, like it hadn't figured out how to carry music yet. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, one hand still clutching the faded, black violin case with peeling edges and the initials RM carved near the handle. It wasn't just a violin. It was what was left of her father, Raymond Miles, a man who played on street corners in Atlanta like he belonged on the stage of Carnegie, a man who taught her Bach before she learned multiplication, a man who once told her, "If they won't listen to your voice, Z, make them listen to your strings." She'd been listening to that advice her whole life. Today, she hoped she wouldn't have to. The front office buzzed with that eerie bureaucratic hum. Computers clacking, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional beep of a visitor's sign-in badge. Nobody looked up when she entered. No hello, no smile. Just a click of a keyboard and a monotone secretary who handed her a schedule like it was a traffic ticket. Lockers down the 6B hallway, the woman said without eye contact. Zariah nodded once, took the paper, and left the office as quietly as she came. She walked the halls like someone in a museum she wasn't allowed to touch, eyes down, footsteps soft. Merryweather was bigger than her last school, with polished tile floors and banners that read things like strive, serve, succeed. But behind the walls were whispers, some curious, some cruel, none kind. By the end of third period, she already had nicknames. Violin girl, quiet chick, transfer with the eyes. She heard them in passing. Not yelled, not teased, just whispered, which somehow hurt more. But Zariah didn't flinch. She had a plan. No drama, no spotlight, no mistakes. Just get through the year, get good grades, and maybe audition for a real U symphony one day. She wasn't here to be anyone's example, and definitely not anyone's target. She kept her headphones around her neck, even when they weren't playing anything. It was her version of armor. People usually left you alone when they thought you couldn't hear them. Then came sixth period, room 104, orchestra. Her stomach tightened. Music was the only class she actually looked forward to, but it was also the one where she was most exposed. The door creaked open as she stepped in. The room smelled faintly of rosin, sheet music, and the plastic of second-hand chairs. Instruments were being tuned, strings whining like sirens in mid-stretch. Kids chatted in clusters, some running through scales, others just slouched in their seats. At the front stood Mr. Roland Fletcher, mid-50s, thin hair slicked back like he was still holding on to some kind of former glory. He wore a brown blazer that looked like it hadn't fit right since the 90s and glasses that he kept sliding back up the bridge of his nose with an annoyed tap of one finger. He didn't smile when she entered. He didn't say welcome or glad to have you. Instead, he turned to the class and announced in a clipped voice, "We have a new addition." Like he was introducing a new piece of furniture. "This is Zariah Miles. She'll be with us for the rest of the semester." He said her name like it was a mistake on a report card. Zariah gave a small nod. No one clapped. A few heads turned. One kid whispered something behind his hand. Mr. Fletcher didn't ask what she played, didn't ask where she came from, just pointed with his baton. Yes, he had an actual baton toward the back row. Zariah walked to the far corner, slid into a seat, and gently set her violin case on the floor. She felt eyes follow her, but she kept her head down. She didn't open her instrument, didn't say a word. The class continued. Mr. Fletcher handed out sheet music for a string arrangement of something classical. She didn't even look at the title. She could read it upside down and backwards if she wanted to, but she didn't want to. Not yet. Over the next 2 weeks, she kept to the plan. She played only when required, joined softly in group rehearsals, never drew attention. Her posture was perfect. Her bow hand didn't tremble, but she held back, just enough not to be noticed, just enough to stay safe. But sometimes safety draws suspicion. Mr. Fletcher began watching her more closely, not with admiration, with skepticism. He didn't like how quiet she was. He didn't like that she never asked questions. And he definitely didn't like that some of the more advanced students were starting to turn their heads when she played. Just a little. One girl, a cellist named Lonnie, leaned over during tuning and whispered, "You play better than half the kids who get solos. And you don't even try." Zariah didn't answer, just smiled politely and tightened her bow. But Mr. Fletcher saw the exchange, and he didn't smile back. There was something simmering beneath his surface, a growing itch, a need to cut her down before the room realized what he was starting to suspect. By the end of the second week, Zariah knew the hallways by heart, which stairwells were always crowded, which lockers didn't latch, which students were loud because they were scared, and which teachers watched her like they were waiting for a reason to speak her name. She kept walking, head down, shoulders square, fingers curled softly around the handle of that battered violin case. She didn't know it yet, but someone was about to give her that reason, and the whole room would listen. The door to room 104 always creaked just slightly too long, like it wanted to announce your entrance before you even stepped inside. Zariah hated that door. She arrived a minute early, hoping to avoid the crowd of orchestra students who usually trickled in 5 seconds before the bell. But the room was already humming with sound, violins being tuned, cello spikes tapping the floor, and laughter that rose and dropped like theater curtains. She stepped in and headed straight for her seat in the back. No eye contact, no words, just one hand gripping the handle of her case, and the other curled around the strap of her backpack, like it was keeping her upright. Mr. Fletcher stood at the front with his back turned, scribbling something on the whiteboard with long, aggressive strokes. His brown blazer, creased and too tight at the shoulders, clung to his frame like it didn't want to be there either. He spoke without turning around. "Tuning starts now. First chairs lead your sections." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It had that certain texture, flat, sharp-edged, like a cymbal being scraped across concrete. The kind of voice that didn't need to shout to make people sit up straighter. Zariah opened her violin case slowly, quietly. She lifted the instrument like it was porcelain and rested it on her lap, fingers brushing lightly across the worn chin rest. Her bow, the same one her father had rosined before every show on Peachtree Street, still smelled faintly like the pine sap she remembered from summers in Atlanta. She tuned without looking at anyone, eyes focused on the fine tuners, the scroll, the delicate alignment of the bridge. It was second nature now, like brushing her teeth or breathing through anxiety. When she looked up, Mr. Fletcher was facing the class. He had the kind of posture that looked like it had been trained into him by disappointment. Shoulders slightly hunched, jaw tense, glasses low on the bridge of his nose. His eyes flicked across the room until they landed on her, and then stopped. She felt it before she saw it. A pause, a beat too long. Not curiosity, not concern. Assessment, that's what it was. Like she was a problem to be solved, or more accurately, contained. "You," he said, tapping his baton against the music stand. "Miles, is it?" Zariah gave a small nod. "You play violin, obviously." It wasn't a question, more like a declaration of inconvenience. She nodded again. "Have you had formal instruction?" She hesitated. "Yes." He narrowed his eyes. "Private or public?" She blinked. "Private." He scoffed, a low, involuntary sound, one that said more than any sentence could. Interesting," he said. "Well, you'll catch up. Eventually." He turned away before she could respond, before the faintest flicker of resistance could even register in her body. The conversation was over, not because it had ended, but because he had dismissed it. Dismissed her. Mr. Fletcher moved through the class like a conductor who'd long since stopped believing in the orchestra. He barked instructions at the cello section, scolded the violists for missing entrances, praised the same 3 violinists for phrasing their dynamics just right. They were the same students every time, well-dressed, well-practiced, and well-connected. Their names were always said in full. Clear, loud, proud. Zariah noticed he hadn't said hers once. Not fully, not properly. Just Miles. Like it was a job title. Student. Black. Background noise. She played when asked. Softly. Accurately. just enough to prove she knew what she was doing, but not enough to make anyone feel threatened. Or so she thought. But Fletcher saw more than she realized. He noticed her bow hand never shook, that her tone was too clean for someone new, that her fingers shifted positions with instinct, not hesitation. And maybe that's what bothered him. She wasn't trying to impress him, and that made him uncomfortable. After class, she stayed a moment longer to tighten the strings back into place and wipe down her instrument with the same soft cloth she always used. Mr. Fletcher watched her, saying nothing, then turned back to his desk and began stacking papers with a little more force than necessary. As she zipped her case, she heard him murmur to no one in particular, "Everyone thinks they can play," until someone actually listens. Zariah didn't flinch, but her fingers curled just a little tighter around the handle of her violin. That evening back home, she set the instrument on her bed, turned off the lights, and lay down beside it in the dark. She let the silence wash over her, not the kind that hurts, but the kind that heals, the kind her father called the breath before music. She hadn't told her mom about what happened. She didn't need to. Her mom always knew when Zariah had been made to feel small. "Rough day?" her mother asked from the kitchen. Zariah answered with the truth she could manage. "Just normal." Her mom didn't press. She never did. She just kept chopping onions and softly said, "Normal doesn't mean it's okay." Zariah didn't reply, because in room 104 she already knew that. Mondays started like every other day, gray skies, rust on the bus rails, and the stale smell of old textbooks and hallway bleach. But by sixth period, the air felt different. Zariah felt it the moment she stepped into room 104. It was subtle, quieter than usual, not peaceful, more like the quiet before a crack of thunder. Students were already seated, instruments in hand, eyes flicking toward the door as she entered. Not everyone looked up, but the ones who did held their gaze just a little too long. Some out of curiosity, a few out of expectation. One or two, maybe even hope. Zariah crossed the room with the same careful steps she always took, slipping into her seat in the back row. Her violin case rested against her leg like an anchor. She kept her eyes on the floor, on the scuff marks, on anything but the front of the room. But that didn't stop Mr. Fletcher from watching her. He didn't smile. He didn't greet her. He just stood at the podium with his baton pressed between his fingers, tapping it once, twice, against the stand like he was waiting for something, or someone. When the bell rang, he didn't begin with announcements. No warm-up, no scales, no group rehearsal. He cleared his throat. "We're starting today a little differently." A couple of students glanced at each other. One girl in the cello section muttered, "Here we go." Mr. Fletcher looked directly at Zariah. "Miles, you've been very quiet." The room fell still. A few heads turned toward the back. Zariah's heart skipped. She looked up slowly, her hand still on the latch of her violin case. "You've been here nearly a month," Fletcher continued, "and I don't believe we've heard what you can do. Don't you think it's time we find out?" The sentence hung in the air like a challenge, not an invitation. A test. Zariah hesitated. Her fingers froze over the worn leather handle. She wasn't ready for this. Not like this. Not in front of them. And definitely not under his spotlight. But Fletcher didn't wait for an answer. He stepped aside from the podium with a sarcastic sweep of his hand. "Front and center, if you please. Let's hear what kind of magic you've got." The word magic dripped from his tongue like it was poison. Mocking. Deliberate. This wasn't curiosity. It was a setup. It was the moment the teacher told black student to play violin to mock her. The room stiffened. Some kids snickered. One boy in the second row leaned to his friend and whispered, "She's gonna crash and burn." Zariah stood. Her knees weren't shaking, but they felt heavy. She walked in front of the room slowly, deliberately, her violin cradled in one arm, her bow in the other. She didn't look at anyone. Not Fletcher. Not the students. Just the empty music stand in front of her. She placed her music on it, even though she wouldn't need it. And then she paused. Her fingers tightened around the bow. She closed her eyes for just a breath. Fletcher's voice interrupted the silence. "Don't worry. We won't judge too harshly. A few laughs followed. Quiet ones. But those were always the ones that hurt the most. Zariah opened her eyes. She didn't speak. Didn't blink. She lifted her violin, rested it under her chin, and placed a bow on the string with a precision that came from years of repetition in the cramped living room of a second-floor apartment back in Atlanta. And then she played. Not something flashy. Not loud or fast or showy. She chose a slow, melancholic line from a lesser-known movement by Dvorak, one that sounded like longing in a cold wind, one her father used to hum while fixing his bowstrings on street corners. The first note cut the room like a thread pulled tight, then the second, then the third. Her fingers danced without effort, guiding the bow like it had a heartbeat of its own. The classroom changed. No one laughed. No one moved. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to hush. Fletcher stood frozen, arms folded tight, lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unreadable. But his knuckles were white around the baton. She played for 40 seconds. Maybe less. But in that time, she told a story without ever opening her mouth. When the final note faded, the room didn't erupt. It didn't clap. It just held its breath. Zariah lowered her violin, placed her bow back on the stand, and stepped to the side like nothing had happened. Someone in the back whispered, "Damn." Mr. Fletcher said nothing. He looked at her, not in admiration, not in respect, but in something closer to fear, because he'd just seen something he couldn't unsee, something he hadn't expected, and something he couldn't control. Zariah returned to her seat. She didn't look around, didn't smile, but inside, she knew something had changed, not just in that room, but in herself. By Tuesday morning, the story had already begun to spread, not loudly, not through announcements or gossip blasts. It moved in glances, in nods, in the way kids turned their heads just a little longer when Zariah Miles walked past in the hallway. The performance in room 104 had done something Fletcher didn't intend. It gave her presence. She still didn't speak much. She still ate lunch alone, on the far side of the cafeteria near the vending machines. But when she lifted the lid of her violin case after sixth period, the room didn't just hear wooden strings. It listened, and Fletcher hated that. He didn't show it, not directly. His face was the same polite stern, his tone still clipped and professional. But his rhythm had shifted. Something in his routine had broken, and now he was searching for a way to reset it. On Wednesday, he found it. "Today we're doing something a little different," he said as the class settled in. He stood at the podium with that old baton between his fingers, tapping it against his open score. A few students groaned, anticipating drills. But Fletcher wasn't looking at them. He was looking straight at Zariah. "We're going to do a cold solo round," he continued. "No sheet music. Just a few bars, off memory. Something you know. Something you feel." Zariah's stomach turned. She didn't flinch, but her grip on the violin case tightened. Fletcher smiled, not warmly. "With teeth. Let's start from the back today." Every head in the room pivoted. "Back row. Zariah." "Of course." "Zariah, why don't you kick us off?" It wasn't a question. She stood slowly, her fingers already unclipping the case. She moved with practiced calm, each motion deliberate, not a single breath wasted. But she knew this wasn't about music. This was about control. Fletcher hadn't forgotten how he'd been silenced 2 days earlier. And now, he was trying to remind the class who held the baton. Zariah took her place at the front again. She didn't need the music stand this time. She didn't even look at Fletcher. As she lifted the violin to her chin, he muttered, just loud enough for the room to hear, "Let's hope we didn't just catch lightning in a bottle." A few students laughed. Nervous laughs. The kind people use when they don't want to pick a side. Zariah didn't blink. She placed the bow to the string. And she played. Not something soft. Not something safe. She chose Fritz Kreisler's Preludium and Allegro. Bold, fast, unapologetically complex. The kind of piece that demanded agility, control, and a level of musical instinct that no cold reed could fake. The notes came like firecrackers, tight and intentional, but never chaotic. Every phrase danced in and out of tension, her fingers flying across the fingerboard like they belonged there, like they always had. The room stopped breathing. Even the students who didn't know classical music felt it. Zariah wasn't performing. She was claiming space. And Fletcher? He stepped back, not dramatically, just a half step, but it was enough. She finished with a clean, controlled cadence. The silence that followed was even heavier than the one after Monday. Zariah lowered the violin and turned to step away. "Impressive," Fletcher said, his voice forced and too crisp. For someone who doesn't exactly look like the conservatory type, the air cracked, not from the words themselves, but from the truth behind them. No one laughed this time. Even the ones who usually found Fletcher funny looked stunned. A boy in the cello section dropped his gaze to the floor. One of the violin girls in the front row sat rigid, her knuckles white around her bow. Zariah froze. She didn't turn around, but her entire body stiffened like a wire pulled taut. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared at the floor for a long second, letting the silence do what words couldn't. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Let's move on. Jonah, you're next." But Jonah didn't move. His hands trembled slightly, beneath the weight of what had just happened. No one wanted to follow that. Zariah walked back to her seat. She set her violin gently in her lap, fingers still curled tight around the bow. Her heartbeat wasn't racing. It was steady, loud, like it was keeping time with something bigger than music. She skipped her seventh period. Instead, she walked straight to the guidance office and asked to see Ms. Reyes. When the counselor saw her standing at the door, violin case in hand and lips pressed into a tight line, she didn't ask any questions. She just nodded toward the chair across from her desk. Zariah sat down, straight-backed. "I'm not here to report anything," she said. Ms. Reyes waited. "I just want to know if there are any music programs. Outside of school. Somewhere else I can play." The counselor tilted her head slightly. "You're the girl who played yesterday, right?" Zariah nodded once. "I had 2 teachers ask about you within an hour," Reyes said softly. Zariah looked down. "I just want a space where it's about the music, not everything else." Ms. Reyes reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded flyer. "There's a youth program downtown. Saturday mornings. They don't care where you come from. They care how you play." Zariah took the flyer without a word. That night, she practiced in the corner of their apartment. Her mother didn't ask what happened, but when Zariah finished playing, she left a plate of food beside her and kissed the top of her head. "You're doing more than playing," her mother said. Zariah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The violin had already said it for her. Zariah didn't tell anyone about the flyer. She folded it twice and slipped it between the pages of her sketchbook, then slid the book under her mattress like a secret. She wasn't trying to hide it out of fear. She was protecting it. Because in a school where the smallest action could spiral into a whisper headline, hope needed privacy. The days that followed were quieter, not because the tension had gone away, but because it had settled in, like dust after collapse. Room 104 continued as if nothing had happened, but everyone moved differently now. Even Fletcher. He still barked instructions, still praised his favorites, still flicked his baton like it was an extension of his ego. But he didn't look at Zariah. He didn't call her name. He erased her. And somehow, that felt worse than the mockery. On Wednesday, she entered room 104 to find the board already marked with ensemble pieces. Her name wasn't assigned any first or second chairs. She was lumped into the general string section. No solo passages, no leadership roles. Just background. Zariah didn't argue. She unpacked her violin, tuned her strings, and took her seat like a shadow. But she played clean. Always clean. Her bow strokes were invisible, but every note left fingerprints. And Fletcher knew it. That made it worse. Because ignoring her couldn't unhear what the room already knew. She wasn't lucky. She was better than most of them. Maybe better than all. But instead of admiration, what followed was a slow ripple of discomfort. By Thursday, students had stopped looking away when she passed in the halls. Some still stared, others nodded. A few whispered her name like it was a trending headline. She ignored it all, At lunch, she sat alone as usual. Except this time, a junior named Jalen from the cello section walked by and quietly dropped a folded note on her tray. Zariah unfolded it slowly. In tiny, all-caps writing, it read, "You're the reason I dusted off my cello." There was no name, no Instagram handle, just those 10 words. Zariah folded it twice and slid it into her sketchbook. Next, a flyer. That evening, she stood in front of her mirror, hair still damp from the shower, and stared at herself for a long time. Her violin leaned against the wall in its case, unopened. She wasn't sure if what she felt was pride or pressure. Maybe both. She picked up a flyer again. Stonemount Youth Ensemble. Auditions open this Saturday. We're looking for musicians who have something to say. Zariah reread the last line. Not who can play. Not who follow rules. Who have something to say. She didn't sleep much that night. Friday morning, she walked straight to the guidance office before first period. Ms. Reyes looked up, surprised. "Zariah? Everything okay?" Zariah nodded, then hesitated. "Can I ask something?" "Of course." Zariah stepped forward. "What happens if someone like me gets noticed?" Ms. Reyes tilted her head slightly. "Notice how?" "Like, if a school doesn't like how you play, but someone else does." Reyes set her pen down. Her face softened. "That's not the first time I've heard a question like that." Zariah didn't respond. Reyes continued. "Let me guess. You don't want drama. You just want to play." Zariah nodded. Reyes leaned forward. "Sometimes the world will try to pull you into a fight you didn't ask for, just because your silence made someone else feel small." Zariah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't want to fight him. I know. I don't want to prove anything." "But you already did," Reyes said. "By existing. By being good in a space that told you not to be." Zariah swallowed. "Is that my fault?" "No," Reyes said firmly. "But it's your power." That Saturday, Zariah stood outside the Stonemount Community Arts Center with her violin in one hand and doubt in the other. The building wasn't fancy, faded brick, buzzing fluorescent sign, and a rusty bike rack out front. But inside, the walls were covered in photos. Kids of all shades, holding clarinets, violas, flutes, bows. Laughing, beaming, no uniforms, no pressure, just sound. She walked in slowly. A man at the front desk smiled warmly. "Here for auditions?" Zariah nodded. "Name?" "Zariah Miles." He scanned the sheet, checked her in, and handed her a small numbered sticker. "Warm-up rooms to the left. You'll be up in 15. Inside the warm-up room, she found 3 other kids, one strumming a guitar, another plucking a stand-up bass, and a girl looping through a jazz melody on a saxophone. No one stared. No one measured her. She took a deep breath, unpacked her violin, and began to play a scale, slow, focused, like she was tuning herself. For the first time in weeks, no one was waiting for her to mess up. No sarcasm, no pressure, just space. And in that space, Zariah's sound grew. When her name was called, she stepped into the audition room with steady feet and a calm she didn't know she still had. She didn't say much, just nodded, introduced a piece, and played a movement from Sibelius' Violin Concerto. It wasn't flawless. She missed one shift, but her heart stayed in every measure. When she finished, no one clapped. They didn't need to. The panel of 3 judges, 2 women and 1 man, all professional musicians, just exchanged glances. "Thank you, Zariah," one of them said. "That was real." She nodded once, packed up, and walked outside into the early spring air. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an entrance. Monday came with a sky the color of cold steel. Zariah stepped off the bus like she always did. Backpack slung tight over one shoulder, violin case in her hand, headphones around her neck, though nothing played through them. But something had changed. She could feel it in the way the halls tilted when she walked by. Not literally, of course, but the air bent differently now, like people had stopped looking past her and started looking at her. She didn't like it. Not because she didn't deserve the attention, but because it felt like a warning flare. something the world shot into the sky before the backlash hit. Room 104 was no different. She walked in just before the bell, took her usual seat in the back, and kept her eyes on the fine-tuners of her violin. But even before she touched the strings, she felt it. Eyes. Not many. Just a few. But they lingered. 2 boys in the second-row cello section whispered behind their folders. A girl in the front chair section kept glancing over her shoulder like she was waiting for Zariah to do something outrageous, like pull fire from the F-holes of her instrument. But Zariah didn't move any differently. She tuned her a string, then D, then G and E. Same posture, same breathing, same grip. The only thing that had changed was them and Mr. Fletcher. He hadn't said her name in 5 days. Not once. He acknowledged everyone else, called on students, praised about technique, corrected fingering errors with his usual passive-aggressive elegance. But Zariah? Nothing. It was like he'd ripped a page from the class roster and taped it over her seat. But the thing about silence? It never means nothing. In fact, sometimes silence says more than words ever could. When rehearsal began, Fletcher assigned solo bars to his usual picks: Rachel, Chloe, Marcus. The same kids who showed up with expensive carbon fiber bows and instruments that gleamed like polished silverware. Zariah's name didn't appear on the board. Not for solos. Not even for section leads. She wasn't surprised. But the rest of the room? They noticed. Lonnie, the cellist from a few chapters back, raised her hand halfway through rehearsal. Mr. Fletcher, are we rotating solo sections this week? Fletcher didn't look up from his sheet music. No need, he replied. We're going with consistency. Lonnie glanced at Zariah. Zariah kept her eyes forward. She didn't need defending. She didn't need drama. She just needed to play. At lunch, Brielle from the violin section slid into the seat across from her with a tray and zero hesitation. Zariah blinked. Relax, Brielle said, picking at a bruised apple. I'm not here to make it weird. Zariah said nothing. I just wanted to say, what you played last week, that wasn't just good. That was something else. Zariah looked up. Thanks. And Fletcher? He's being an ass. Zariah gave the smallest of smiles. That's not news. Brielle chuckled, and for a second, the cafeteria didn't feel like a war zone. Back in room 104, the second half of the class was spent rehearsing Mozart's Divertimento. Fletcher moved through the aisles like a monarch inspecting his court, stopping occasionally to correct fingerings with soft claps or a flick of his baton. Then, with 20 minutes left, he made his move. Let's do something a little different, he said, his voice falsely light. Let's go section by section. Quick 4-bar solos. No pressure. A collective groan spread through the room. Don't worry, Fletcher added, his smile razor thin. I won't make it hard. We'll start with cello and end with violins. Zariah already knew what was coming. 10 minutes later, she was the only one left uncalled. She kept her violin across her lap, her bow resting on her knee. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Fletcher looked right at her. Zariah, he said at last, her name a scalpel on his tongue. Would you care to close us out? She met his eyes for the first time in days. He raised an eyebrow. Unless we've used up all our lightning. A couple of nervous chuckles fluttered around the room, but they died quickly. Zariah stood. She didn't rush, didn't adjust her shoulders like she needed to prove something. She stepped forward, tucked the violin under her chin, and without a single word, she played. No flashy intro, no crescendo for show. She chose Bartok, raw, rhythmic, grounded in folk roots and layered with calculated chaos. It wasn't safe. It wasn't pretty, but it was hers. The room stilled. The other students stopped fidgeting. Even Fletcher's smile froze mid-breath. She finished with a bow stroke that sliced the silence in half. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't bow. She simply walked back to her seat and placed her instrument across her knees. The room didn't applaud, but no one laughed either. Fletcher didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. Then, in the driest voice he could muster, he said, "Thank you. That was a choice." Someone coughed to mass attention. And just like that, he moved on. Let's reset from measure 42. But the damage had been done. Zariah had spoken, not in words, not in protest, but in notes that defied erasure. And everyone had heard it. Even the ones too scared to admit they understood what they were hearing. By Friday, the whispers had evolved. They weren't whispers anymore. They were conversations. In the cafeteria, in the halls, at lockers and outside the gym. Zariah's name was now a reference point, not a rumor. Students asked where she learned to play. Some tried to guess what music school she came from. Others just stared when she passed, as if looking for signs of whatever magic they'd heard about. Zariah hated all of it, because none of it was about her. It was about a performance, a moment, a myth they'd created and passed around like a secret. And she knew how people treated secrets. They either exposed them or tried to break them. 6th period. Room 104. Fletcher was already at the front, writing something on the board with an unusual air of calm. He didn't flinch when the bell rang. He didn't bark orders or flick his baton with annoyance. He turned around, folded his hands neatly, and said, "Before we begin rehearsal, I'd like to offer an opportunity." That sentence alone caused the entire room to shift. "I think it's important," he continued, "that we give our students a chance to showcase what they're capable of outside the usual framework." He looked directly at Zariah and smiled, but it wasn't kindness behind that smile. It was calculation. Everyone could feel it. "I'd like to invite Zariah Miles," he said, "to perform a solo of her choosing for class." The room froze. Zariah's pulse ticked in her ears. This wasn't admiration. This was strategy. This was a trap. The students didn't know whether to cheer or hold their breath. Some exchanged nervous glances. A few shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Zariah stood slowly. She didn't look at Fletcher. She didn't ask if she had to. She already knew the answer. She walked to the front of the room with the quiet grace of someone who'd learned how to step around glass. She placed her violin case on the stool, opened it, and carefully lifted the instrument. Fletcher stepped aside, giving her a generous 3 feet of space, as if he were doing her a favor. "No pressure," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "We're all just curious what kind of training you've had." Zariah paused mid-tune. The room recoiled just slightly. He was doing it again, smiling while he cut her down. She didn't respond, didn't blink. She tucked the violin under her chin, adjusted her grip on the bow, and inhaled once, slow and deep. Then she began. She didn't play something safe. She didn't play something pretty. She played Shostakovich, Violin Concerto No. 1 in a minor, a piece that demanded rage and restraint in equal measure. The opening was dark, even brooding. Her fingers climbed and fell with raw control, like she wasn't following sheet music, but rather translating her insides into sound. Every note was exact, sharp, alive. Students leaned forward. Fletcher didn't move. Zariah didn't look at him. Not once. She wasn't playing for him. She was playing through him. The classroom disappeared. The walls folded inward. The windows softened into watercolor. There was only the violin and the truth she was carving with it. When the final note dropped, it didn't fall, it landed. Heavy, whole. She lowered her instrument slowly, breathing like she just finished running uphill. And still no one clapped, because no one wanted to break the silence. It wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even the fluorescent lights hummed softer. Zariah turned and walked back to her seat. Mr. Fletcher opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. After class, Zariah packed up quickly. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. Her hands trembled just enough to betray the adrenaline still coiling in her veins. She made it to the hallway when Brielle caught up with her. "Girl," she whispered. "He looked like he swallowed a lemon." Zariah almost laughed. "Almost. Are you going to do the spring concert?" Brielle asked. "I don't know yet." "You should. He can't hide behind sarcasm forever." Zariah didn't answer. She wasn't thinking about Fletcher. She was thinking about what it meant to take backspace in a room designed to erase you. But Fletcher wasn't done. The next morning, While Zariah rehearsed at the community center, Mr. Fletcher filed a formal report with the vice principal. In it, he accused Zariah of being performatively disruptive, claiming she had deliberately derailed the class's rehearsal structure for personal gain. The language was slick, strategic, polished, just like him. But what he didn't expect: 3 students submitted their own statements before the end of the day, and 2 teachers who weren't even in the room had already heard about it, and were asking questions. That evening, Zariah sat on the balcony of her apartment with her mom. The sun was going down, streaks of orange bleeding into the brick buildings of Stonemount. Her violin case sat next to her unopened, but she could feel it humming beside her. "You okay?" her mom asked, watching her out of the corner of her eye. Zariah shrugged. He tried to make it feel like a gift. Her mom raised an eyebrow. "What did you do?" "I took it anyway," she said, "but I played on my own terms." Her mother nodded. "Good. Because the truth is, baby, no one can give you what you already own." Monday came with a kind of stillness that didn't feel natural. The bell echoed longer in the halls. Conversations were hushed. Even the teachers walked with stiffer backs, like they were holding something in. Zariah felt at the moment she walked to the front doors of Merryweather High. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was that sense that something had happened without her permission. She didn't have to wait long to find out. Second period, just before the start of English class. A voice buzzed through the intercom. "Zariah Miles, please report to front office." A few heads turned. One student muttered under their breath, "Now what?" Zariah didn't react. She packed her things slowly, slung her backpack over one shoulder, and grabbed the handle of her violin case like it was armor. She walked the entire length of the hallway with eyes trailing her like shadows. The front office was quiet. Too quiet. The secretary barely looked up as she gestured Zariah toward a conference room at the back. Inside, 2 people sat waiting. Principal Lynette Carr, mid-40s, firm voice, soft eyes, someone who'd worked in the system long enough to understand its cracks. Next to her sat Assistant Superintendent Gerard Langley, sharply dressed, a man whose smile felt like it came from a different room than the one he was in. Zariah stepped in, back straight, not blinking. Principal Carr spoke first. "Zariah, thank you for coming in." She nodded once. "Am I in trouble?" Carr folded her hands. "Not exactly." Langley opened a slim black folder. "We received a report from Mr. Fletcher regarding last Friday's class session," he said, reading from page. "He stated that your solo performance disrupted the rehearsal structure and that your behavior was intentionally performative, potentially undermining his authority in the classroom." There it was. Zariah stared at the table. The words stung, but they didn't surprise her. Langley continued. "He described your performance as emotionally provocative and suggested it created an imbalance in the learning environment. Emotionally provocative, as if she had thrown a tantrum with a bow and a bridge, as if telling the truth through sound was a crime." Zariah finally spoke. "I was asked to play." Carr nodded slowly. "We're aware. In fact, 3 of your classmates submitted written statements over the weekend. All of them described your performance as focused, respectful, and inspiring." Langley didn't flinch. He just closed the folder. 2 staff members also reached out. Neither were in the room, but they'd heard about it within hours. Carr added, "It made an impact." Zariah looked up. "So why am I here?" Carr leaned forward, voice lower. "Because we want to understand how you're feeling. Whether anything said or implied during class made you uncomfortable. Especially Friday." There it was, the invitation. She could speak now. She could call it what it was. She could say the words, "He tried to humiliate me." She could quote his dig about how she didn't look like the conservatory type. She could say it out loud, but she didn't. Not yet, because she understood something Fletcher didn't. Power is not always in speaking. Sometimes it's in choosing what not to say. "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone," she said quietly. "I just played when I was told to." Carr nodded. "We believe you." Langley watched her for a moment, then pushed the folder aside. "If anything like this happens again, you're encouraged to come directly to us." Zariah didn't answer, because they were looking for a headline. A quote, something they could manage. But what she carried wasn't designed for management. It was bigger than that. Back in room 10 for that afternoon, everything looked the same. But it wasn't. Fletcher didn't say a word to her, didn't call on her, didn't make eye contact. He simply pretended she didn't exist. And that should have felt like a win. But it didn't. It felt like being erased. Not ridiculed, not praised, just absent. And somehow, the absence was louder than any insult. After class, Brielle caught up with her outside the stairwell. "So," he filed a report. Zariah said simply. Brielle's eyes widened. "You serious?" Zariah nodded. "What did you say?" "Nothing that would make him happy." Brielle let out a low whistle. "I swear, that man's allergic to being outshined." Zariah chuckled, but it was short, hollow. "People are watching now." Brielle added, "That makes him nervous." "Good," Zariah said. But deep down, she wasn't playing chess with Mr. Fletcher. She was just trying to survive the board. That night, Zariah found herself staring at the old flyer from a youth ensemble again. The edges were worn from being touched too many times. But the words still rang true. "We're looking for musicians who have something to say." She hadn't just played a piece. She'd said something. And the adults in power were deciding whether they wanted to hear it. That's what this was really about. Not music. Control. She didn't sleep much that night. But when she finally closed her eyes, her fingers twitched softly, like they were still holding the bow, still remembering the feeling of playing for herself, still choosing music over permission. Monday passed without a word from Fletcher. Tuesday, too. He'd gone fully silent, not just toward Zariah, but toward the entire class. His corrections were clipped, his praise non-existent. It was like he was moving through molasses, each step in front of the whiteboard dragged down by the weight of something he didn't dare admit. He'd lost control of the room. But Zariah? She moved through the week like a shadow with roots. Still quiet, still alone at lunch, still not saying much. But the difference was this. People looked now, not out of mockery, not pity, but a kind of reluctant respect. The kind that made students straighten up when she walked by. The kind that kept even the loudest kids from talking while she tuned her violin. She hadn't planned to become a symbol. She just wanted to survive the year. But something had shifted, and she couldn't unshift it. Thursday morning, she opened her locker and paused. Inside, just above her books, was a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't taped, just resting, deliberately placed, carefully tucked. Her heart kicked once, cautious. She looked left, then right. Nobody near. She unfolded the paper slowly, eyes scanning the blocky, typed letters. You reminded us what it sounds like when truth is played without fear. That was it. No name, no contact, just that sentence. And yet it held more weight than any compliment she'd ever received. She read it again. Then again. It wasn't flattery. It wasn't fandom. It was recognition. Someone had seen her, really seen her. That afternoon, just as she was about to leave school, she was stopped outside the band room by Ms. Reyes, the counselor. "Zariah, you got a sec?" Zariah adjusted the strap of her backpack and nodded. Ms. Reyes smiled. Not the overly bright kind adults used when they were trying to be cool. This one was warm. "Real. I want you to meet someone." Zariah blinked. "Now." "She's in the music wing." "Just 5 minutes." Zariah followed. They stopped at the side entrance of the performance room. Inside, a woman stood in front of a cello student, nodding rhythmically as the kid bowed through a practice scale. The woman looked to be in her early 50s, gray streaks in her tight coils, soft linen blazer, posture like she conducted orchestras before breakfast. Ms. Reyes tapped the doorframe lightly. The woman turned, eyes instantly sharp but kind. "Helena," Ms. Reyes said, "this is Zariah Miles." The woman's lips curved. Not surprised. Not unsure. "I've heard about you," she said softly. "The way people talk, you'd think you walked into the room holding lightning." Zariah felt her cheeks warm. "I just played." "That's usually how it starts." Ms. Reyes stepped aside. "Ms. Helena Maddox is the director of the Stone Mount Youth Ensemble." Zariah's heart stopped for a second. She'd seen the name before, on the flyer, the one still pressed between the pages of her sketchbook. Maddox stepped forward, looking Zariah up and down, not judgmentally, but with musician's eyes. "I was at the Civic Center last season," she said. "Didn't hear a sound that made me pause." She held up a finger. "Until this week, your name's come up 3 times, all from different mouths. And they weren't asking about your grades." Zariah swallowed. "Did someone send you?" Maddox smiled. "No one had to." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a pamphlet. The cover read, "Spring Showcase. Solo features, April 22nd. Now accepting applications. I'd like you to be our closing act." Zariah blinked. "You haven't heard me play." "I've heard enough. And I've heard about how you play when people try to shut you down. That's the kind of sound I want our audience to leave with." Zariah hesitated. "What if my school finds out?" Maddox folded her arms. "Then they'll learn something new about what they can't control." That night, Zariah sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, her violin beside her, the pamphlet glowing under the lamplight. She hadn't even opened her case yet. She just stared at the word. Soloist. It didn't feel like a title. It felt like a door, one she'd never thought she'd be allowed to touch. She opened her sketchbook and slid the anonymous note inside the pamphlet, pressing them together like they belonged in the same chapter. And then, for the first time in days, she picked up her bow. She didn't practice scales. She didn't rehearse pieces she'd already mastered. She closed her eyes and just played. Whatever came. Whatever lived under her ribs and hadn't found breath until now. It was messy. It was raw. But it was hers. And it was the beginning of something that no report, no sarcasm, no erasure could contain. By Tuesday morning, something was different at Merryweather High. Not louder. Not more chaotic. Heavier. Like the entire school was holding its breath, and no one wanted to be the first to exhale. The posters went up overnight, printed in neutral blues and taped to every hallway corner, like someone wanted to pretend it was just another after-school event. Student forum, equity, respect in the classroom. Friday, library, 4 p.m., open at all. No names will be discussed. No finger-pointing. But everyone knew exactly who and what it was about. Zariah saw the first flyer outside her homeroom. She didn't need to read it twice. She knew. Everyone did. That afternoon, room 104 was a different battlefield. Fletcher still hadn't mentioned her name, still hadn't made eye contact, but his movements were sharper, his commands more abrupt, like he was preparing for a fight he hadn't been invited to. Zariah kept her eyes on the sheet music, played clean, didn't speak, but the silence between them had become the lesson. And the rest of the class? They weren't ignoring it anymore. They were watching. And waiting. By Thursday, the student body was buzzing. It started small, an overheard comment, a text thread, a side-eye between periods. But by lunch, students were openly talking about the forum. Some were planning to go. Some said it was pointless. A few said they were going just to see if Zariah would speak. Brielle sat beside her at their usual table. "You going?" Zariah didn't answer right away. "I don't know." "You don't have to say anything," Brielle said. "But if you do, I think they'll listen." Zariah looked down at her untouched fruit cup. "I didn't come here to be anyone's example." Brielle shrugged. "Sometimes you don't choose that. Sometimes it chooses you." Friday came fast. The library filled slowly, quietly. Students drifted in, some curious, some restless. Teachers too. A few sat in the back like they wanted to disappear. Even 2 parents showed up, faces tense and unsure, like they weren't sure whose side they were supposed to be on. At the front sat Principal Carr, Ms. Reyes, and 2 student leaders, Mateo from Student Council and Brielle, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk dressed in Vans and hoop earrings. The mic passed from one to another. Mateo started with practice calm. "We're here today not to accuse, but to understand. Sometimes, equity means listening even when it's uncomfortable." Then Brielle spoke. She didn't look at Zariah. She didn't have to. "We watched something unfair happen in a classroom," she said. "We didn't say anything. That's on us. A few students nodded. One kid muttered, "Facts?" The room shifted. Then a parent stood up. "So are we saying the teacher was racist?" Silence. All eyes moved, slowly, naturally, to the girl sitting 3 rows back in a gray hoodie, hands folded tightly in her lap, violin case resting at her feet, like a sleeping dog. Zariah felt her name move through the room without being spoken. She felt the moment waiting for her. She didn't want to stand, but she did. She didn't move to the mic. She didn't need to. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but sharp enough to cut every inch of air. "I didn't want to be a lesson," she said. A ripple moved through the crowd. "I came here to learn like everybody else. I never asked to be called out. I just played when I was told to." The quiet deepened. But when someone tells you out loud or with their silence that your gift doesn't belong in a room, it stays with you, even if you know better, even if you worked your whole life to prove otherwise. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just let the words sit, and the room let them. Someone near the back whispered, "Damn." Under their breath, a teacher folded her arms. Another looked away. Then Mateo spoke again. "Thank you, Zariah. You didn't have to speak, but I'm glad you did." Zariah sat down slowly. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from release. She hadn't broken. She had opened. After the forum, students approached her in small waves. One girl said, "I had a teacher last year. Same thing. I didn't know how to talk about it." A boy added, "I didn't even know we were allowed to call out like that." Even Ms. Reyes came over, her eyes bright. "You didn't just speak for yourself," she said. "You gave the rest of them permission." That night, Zariah returned home to find another note in her locker had slipped into her violin case. You don't just play music. You remind people that silence can speak, too. There was no name, just that line. She slipped it inside her sketchbook with the others. Then she turned on the lamp beside her bed, pulled out her violin, and began practicing for the showcase. Her fingers were steadier than they'd been in weeks. April 22nd arrived on a breeze that felt like something waiting to happen. Zariah stood backstage at the Stone Mountain Civic Center, her violin case open beside her, bow resting gently in her hand. The soft hum of the audience drifted through the velvet curtain. Low voices, shuffling programs, the occasional cough or phone buzz trying to disappear before it embarrassed itself. The theater wasn't massive, maybe 300 seats, but it felt like a coliseum. Out front, families sat in rows, parents in weekend jeans and dress shirts, kids swinging their legs beneath their seats. Some held flowers. Some held nothing but quiet expectation. But everyone held breath for one name, Zariah Miles. She was the final act, the closer. At 14, no pressure. She closed her eyes. Behind her lids, she didn't see the audience. She saw the cracked sidewalk where her father used to play on Peachtree Street. She saw the first time she'd drawn sound from a bow. Her hands too small, her focus too sharp for her age. She saw her mother, holding groceries with one arm and her daughter's music dreams with the other. She saw room 104, the stairs, the smirks, the silence, and then the stage, the quiet, the strings, the truth. Ms. Helena Maddox appeared beside her like a breeze in a suit jacket. "You ready?" Zariah looked up. "I think so." "You don't have to prove anything," Maddox said, her voice warm and grounded. "Not to them, not to me, just to yourself." Zariah nodded. It was enough. Her name was announced with gentle formality. No over-the-top enthusiasm. Just a kind of still, respectful tone that said, "Pay attention. This matters." She stepped into the lights slowly. The stage wasn't decorated. No spotlight choreography. No orchestra behind her. Just her, a single chair, and a wooden floor that carried every footstep like a story being told. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She stood center stage, lifted her violin to her chin, and let the audience sit in the quiet for one moment longer than they expected. Then she played. It wasn't the easiest piece she knew. It wasn't even the cleanest she could have chosen. But it was true. Zariah played a movement from Florence Price's Violin Concerto No. 2, A piece full of pain and hope, joy and rage, legacy and defiance. Music written by someone who had also been told her sound didn't belong in concert halls. Each note moved like breath, alive, intentional, full of memory. The room didn't move. The seats didn't creak. Even the air itself seemed to still, like it didn't want to interrupt her. This wasn't performance. This was presence, a reclamation, a confession, a declaration. Zariah wasn't asking to be accepted anymore. She was commanding to be heard. Her bow danced across the strings with elegance, then grit. Her fingers shifted with a grace that didn't apologize for the hours they'd bled to get here. And when the final measure fell, it didn't die. It landed, whole, defiant, soft. The silence that followed was complete. No claps. Not yet. Just stillness. Then, from the middle rows, a single pair of hands came together. Then another, and another, until the theater erupted. Not wild, not messy, but full. Some stood. Others wiped their cheeks discreetly. Even the ushers near the exit stopped and stared like they'd just seen something they hadn't expected and didn't want to forget. Backstage, Zariah sat on a folding chair, her hand shaking, not from nerves, but release. She didn't cry. She just exhaled. Slow, steady, complete. Ms. Maddox stepped in, eyes damp but proud. You just made it very hard for the next person to follow. Zariah gave a small, tired smile. Good. The next morning, a small local arts blog ran a headline. Teacher told black student to play violin to mock her. Turns out she's a genius musician. Underneath, a photo someone had taken from the back of the auditorium. A silhouette, a bow in midair. Her chin tilted upward, caught mid-note. The piece went viral within 48 hours. Not nationally. Not yet, but enough. Enough for nearby schools to share it. Enough for faculty at Merryweather to read it over coffee in fall quiet. Enough for students to pass it around and whisper, "That's her," in the hallway like it was legend. And Fletcher? He said nothing. Didn't acknowledge it. Didn't post a response. Didn't write her name on the board. But word got out. He'd been removed from the spring showcase planning committee. No public reprimand. No apology. Just a quiet reshuffling. The kind of consequence given to men like him. Soft, silent, and late. Zariah didn't brag. She didn't demand credit. She went to school. She practiced. She kept playing. But something had changed. Now, when she walked the halls, kids asked questions. Not about Fletcher. About music. About where to learn. About where to play. Even one of Fletcher's old favorite students tapped her on the shoulder before class and asked, "Can you help me with a run I'm struggling on?" She said yes, because that's what a leader does. She wasn't playing for Fletcher anymore. She wasn't even playing for herself. She was playing for the girl who used to hide her sheet music because she thought nobody cared. And for every kid watching, waiting, wondering if their voice was worth hearing. 2 weeks after the Civic Center showcase, the hallway chatter had moved on to prom plans, exam stress, the senior prank rumors. Zariah noticed it the way you notice a song, ending quietly, fading instead of stopping. But the silence left a mark. Not the kind that bruised, the kind that carved space. Fletcher still taught room 104. But he moved through the period like a shadow of himself present, but dim the edge in his voice was dull. The sarcasm came less often, and when it did, it landed flat as favorites no longer leaned forward to catch his every word. They were too busy watching someone else now. Zariah, she still sat in the back, still tuned her violin with the same quiet focus. But when she played, the room shifted, because now people knew better than to ignore her. He hadn't been fired, of course not. He'd just been relieved of certain responsibilities. No more student showcases. No more solo assignments. Word had it he'd been quietly removed from the teacher mentorship program too. No announcement. No confrontation. Just silence with structure. The kind reserved for educators who misjudged tone one too many times. One Friday morning, just before rehearsal, a younger student, Maya, a freshman violist, waited at Zariah's locker with her instrument case hugged to her chest. "Hey," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Zariah paused, waiting. "I wanted to ask him, how did you learn to shift like that in the Chrysler?" Zariah smiled gently. "You free during lunch." Maya blinked. "Wait, you'd help me." Zariah nodded. "I'll bring my copy, we'll break it down." Maya's whole face lit up. And just like that, a new story began. That afternoon, Zariah found another note in her locker. This time handwritten, curved, careful letters. "You don't owe us anything, but thank you anyway." She folded it twice and tucked it between the pages of her sketchbook alongside the others. It was starting to look more like a journal now, filled not with her words, but with echoes. Echoes of what she'd done, and what she refused to apologize for. 2 weeks later, she stood at a podium in D.C. invited to speak on a youth panel at a national summit on representation in the arts. She was the youngest person in the room. The stage lights felt warmer than she expected. During the Q&A, a girl, maybe 12, stood up from the third row, clutching her mom's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You look like me," she said. "I thought only famous people could play like that." Zariah's heart cracked and healed in the same second. She knelt, just a little meeting the girl's eyes. "You don't need fame," she said softly. "You just need patience and a little fire." The room clapped, but the girl's shy smile was the loudest sound Zariah heard that day. That night back in Stone Mount, Zariah sat on the balcony with her mom. The city lights blinked below them like fireflies caught in glass. Her violin rested beside her, untouched for once. Her hands were tired, but it was a good tired. "You didn't let it change you," her mom said, voice soft. Zariah looked out at the dark horizon. "It changed the way I see things," she replied. "But I'm still me." Her mom nodded. "Your grandma would have cried her eyes out." They both laughed. And for the first time in weeks, Zariah let herself feel proud. Not because she'd beaten anyone. Not because she'd gone viral or been invited to speak. But because she'd done what she came to do. She played her truth louder than their doubt. Louder than a teacher who tried to clip her wings. Louder than every sideways glance and whispered dismissal. She didn't fight back with insults. She fought back with music. And it was enough. Later that night, as she packed up for the next day's rehearsal, she pulled a sheet of paper from her violin case, an old flyer from weeks ago, the one that first mentioned the showcase. She flipped it over. On the back in faded ink was a quote she'd once ignored. "If someone tries to put you in a box, remind them you're not made of cardboard." She smiled, then wrote underneath it in her own handwriting, "You're made of sound, of memory, of fire they never bothered to understand." When she finally lay down to sleep, violin case closed at her feet, she knew one thing for sure. Her story wasn't over. But from now on, she would be the one holding the bow. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something real, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button to show support for voices that refuse to be silenced. Subscribe so you never miss the next story that dares to speak truth. Share this video with someone who needs to remember what courage sounds like. Because some stories aren't just meant to be watched, they're meant to be felt, remembered, and passed on.